The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets of Oakwood Heights glistening under the evening streetlights. Detective Lisa Washington turned onto Maple Street, the same route she had taken home for the past 6 months since moving to this quiet suburban neighborhood. After 15 years with the FBI, she thought she had found the perfect place to escape the chaos of her job investigating civil rights violations across the country. Her black Honda Accord moved slowly down the tree-lined street. The houses here were nice but not fancy. Each one had a small front yard with carefully trimmed grass and flower beds that showed someone cared about their home. This was exactly what Lisa had wanted when she decided to leave her cramped apartment downtown. A place where she could sit on her front porch with a cup of coffee and actually hear birds singing instead of sirens wailing. Lisa had spent the day reviewing case files about police departments that had problems with how they treated people of different races. It was tough work that often left her feeling drained. Some days she wondered if all her efforts were making any real difference. But then she would remember the families she had helped get justice, and it made everything worthwhile. As she drove past the Thompson house with its bright yellow front door, Lisa noticed something in her rearview mirror. A police car had turned onto her street about 3 blocks back. She thought nothing of it at first. Police cars drove through neighborhoods all the time. It was part of their job to patrol and keep areas safe. But as she made the turn onto Oak Avenue, then another turn onto Pine Street, the police car stayed behind her. Lisa felt a small knot form in her stomach. In her line of work, she had learned to pay attention to these kinds of details. The car wasn't following too closely, but it had made every turn she had made. That could be a coincidence, but her training told her to stay alert. She slowed down slightly, staying well under the speed limit. Her turn signal went on early before she turned into her own driveway. Through her mirror, she could see the patrol car slow down too, pulling to the side of the street instead of continuing on its way. Officer Danny Morrison sat in his patrol car, watching the woman in the Honda. He had been with the Oakwood Heights Police Department for 8 years, and he thought he knew every person who belonged in this neighborhood. This woman, driving slowly and carefully, looked out of place to him. In his mind, she was probably up to something. Morrison had grown up in this area back when it was mostly white families. Over the years, he had watched the neighborhood change as more diverse families moved in. While he never said it out loud, he wasn't happy about these changes. He often found reasons to stop people who he felt didn't fit his idea of who should live in Oakwood Heights. Tonight had been quiet so far. He had given out 2 speeding tickets and responded to a noise complaint about teenagers playing music too loud at the park. He was looking for something more interesting when he spotted the Honda. The driver was a black woman, probably in her 30s, and she was driving through one of the nicest parts of his patrol area. Morrison told himself he was just being careful. Maybe she was looking for houses to break into. Maybe she was selling drugs. Maybe she was up to something else. He didn't have any real evidence, but his gut told him to follow her and see what she was doing. When the Honda turned into the driveway of 847 Pine Street, Morrison felt his suspicions grow stronger. That house belonged to some FBI agent who had moved in recently. He had never seen the agent, but he was pretty sure it wasn't this woman. She was probably trying to break in, or maybe she was meeting someone inside for some kind of illegal deal. Morrison called for backup on his radio. Unit 47 requesting assistance at 847 Pine Street. Possible suspicious activity. The voice that came back was Officer Beth Rodriguez, his usual partner when she was on duty. Unit 23 responding. What's the situation? Got a suspicious person pulling into a driveway. Doesn't look like she belongs here. I'm going to make contact. Rodriguez knew Morrison well enough to recognize the tone in his voice. Over their 2 years working together, she had noticed that he seemed to find a lot of Black and Hispanic people suspicious, even when they were just going about their normal business. She had tried to talk to him about it before, but he always insisted he was just doing his job. Copy that. I'll be there in 3 minutes. Meanwhile, Lisa had parked her car and was gathering her things from the passenger seat. Her briefcase held files she planned to review later that evening. Her purse contained the usual items, plus her FBI credentials and service weapon, which she was required to carry even when off duty. She had noticed the patrol car stop on the street, but she figured the officer was probably just checking on something in the neighborhood. Maybe someone had called about a suspicious noise or a car alarm going off. She had seen police do this kind of routine check many times. Lisa stepped out of her car and walked toward her front door, fishing in her purse for her house keys. The motion sensor light above her garage came on, illuminating her driveway clearly. She was wearing dark jeans and a blue sweater, clothes she had changed into after work because her FBI blazer and slacks felt too formal for an evening at home. Behind her, she heard a car door slam. Heavy footsteps moved across the street and up her driveway. Lisa turned around to see a police officer walking toward her with purpose. He was a white man in his 30s, built like someone who spent time in the gym. His hand rested on his belt, close to his weapon. "Excuse me, ma'am," Morrison called out, his voice carrying more authority than friendliness. "I need to ask you a few questions." Lisa felt her heart rate increase slightly, but she kept her expression calm. In her job, she had learned that staying cool and professional was always the best approach when dealing with law enforcement, even when she was the one being questioned. "Good evening, officer," she replied, turning to face him completely. "How can I help you?" Morrison stopped about 10 feet away from her, his eyes scanning her car and then looking at the house behind her. "What are you doing here tonight?" The question surprised Lisa. She was standing in her own driveway at her own house with her own car. But she knew that getting defensive would only make things worse. "I live here, officer. I just got home from work." Morrison's expression didn't change. "This your house?" "Yes, it is. You got some ID to prove that?" Lisa's training kicked in. She knew her rights, but she also knew that police officers had wide discretion in how they handled situations like this. Being confrontational, even when she was in the right, could escalate things quickly. "Of course. Let me get my driver's license for you." She moved slowly toward her purse, making sure to keep her hands visible. As an FBI agent, she knew how quickly these encounters could go wrong if an officer felt threatened or confused about what someone was reaching for. Lisa pulled her wallet from her purse and carefully removed her driver's license. The address clearly showed 847 Pine Street, exactly where they were standing. She held it out toward Officer Morrison, expecting this simple proof would clear up any confusion and send him on his way. Morrison took the license and examined it under his flashlight, even though the driveway was already well lit. He studied it longer than necessary, as if he was looking for signs that it might be fake. Lisa watched his face, trying to read his expression. Something about his body language told her this wasn't going to be as simple as she had hoped. "This could be anyone's ID," Morrison said finally, handing it back to her. "How do I know you didn't just find this somewhere or get it from someone else?" Lisa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had shown him exactly what he had asked for, but now he was questioning whether her own identification was really hers. "Officer, that's my driver's license with my photo and my address. I can show you other cards with my name if that would help." "I'm going to need to see the registration for this vehicle too," Morrison continued, ignoring her offer. "And I want to know whose car this really is." "It's my car," Lisa replied, keeping her voice steady. "The registration is in the glove compartment. Would you like me to get it?" Morrison's hand moved closer to his weapon. "Yeah, but move slow. Keep your hands where I can see them." Lisa walked back to her car, opened the passenger door, and reached into the glove compartment. She found the registration and insurance papers, both clearly showing her name and address. When she turned around, Morrison had moved closer and was now standing near the hood of her car. "Here you go," she said, offering him the papers. Morrison examined these documents with the same suspicious intensity he had shown her license. Lisa could see him looking back and forth between the papers and her face as if he was trying to solve some kind of puzzle. "You say you live here," Morrison said slowly, "but I've never seen you around this neighborhood before." "I moved here about 6 months ago," Lisa explained. "I work long hours, so I'm not home very much during the day." "What kind of work do you do?" Lisa hesitated for just a moment. She could tell him she worked for the FBI, which would probably end this encounter immediately, but something about Morrison's attitude made her want to see how far he would take this. As someone who investigated police misconduct for a living, she was curious about what was really driving his behavior. "I work for the government," she said, which was Technica. "Lee True." Morrison's expression grew more suspicious. "Government work, huh? What kind of government work has you driving around nice neighborhoods at night?" "I was coming home from my office. It's been a long day." By now, another police car had arrived and parked across the street. Officer Rodriguez stepped out and walked over to join Morrison. She was a smaller woman with short brown hair, and Lisa could see her taking in the scene with careful eyes. What's the situation here? Rodriguez asked Morrison quietly. This woman claims she lives here, but something doesn't add up, Morrison replied, loud enough for Lisa to hear. I think she might be up to something. Rodriguez looked at Lisa, then at the documents Morrison was holding. Her ID and registration match the address? Yeah, but anyone can get fake documents these days, Morrison said. I think we should call this in and see if there have been any break-ins reported in the area. Lisa felt her patience starting to wear thin, but she knew she had to stay calm. Officers, I understand you're just doing your job, but I've shown you my identification and my vehicle registration. Both clearly show that I live at this address and this is my car. What exactly is the problem? Morrison stepped closer to her, and Lisa could see something in his eyes that made her extremely uncomfortable. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was something that looked like anger. The problem is that you're being evasive, Morrison said, his voice getting louder. You're not answering my questions directly, and your whole story sounds fishy to me. I've answered every question you've asked, Lisa replied. I've shown you my identification and my car registration. I'm standing in my own driveway. What more do you need? I need you to stop giving me attitude and start cooperating, Morrison shot back. You think you can just roll up in this neighborhood and act like you own the place? Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. She could see that Morrison was escalating the situation for no good reason, but she wasn't sure how to intervene without undermining her partner in front of a civilian. Danny, maybe we should, she started to say. No, Morrison cut her off. Something's not right here. Look at her. Look at this situation. She shows up in this neighborhood, driving slow like she's looking for something. She pulls into this driveway like she belongs here. Her story's all rehearsed and neat. I think she's been watching this house, waiting for the right time to break in. Lisa stared at Morrison in disbelief. Break in? Officer, this is my house. I have keys to the front door. I can show you mail with my name and address. I can show you photos on my phone of me inside this house. What possible evidence do you have that I don't live here? The evidence is that you don't belong in this neighborhood, Morrison said, and as soon as the words left his mouth, Lisa understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about her identification or her car or whether she lived there. This was about the color of her skin. Morrison had decided that a black woman couldn't possibly belong in this neighborhood, and no amount of evidence was going to change his mind. Officer, Lisa said carefully, I need you to tell me exactly what law you think I'm breaking. Morrison's face flushed red. Don't try to lawyer me, lady. I know when something's wrong, and this whole situation is wrong. What's wrong about it? Lisa pressed. I'm standing in my own driveway with my own car with identification that proves I live here. Explain to me what's wrong about that. Morrison was getting more agitated by the second. He felt like this woman was challenging his authority, questioning his judgment, and making him look bad in front of his partner. In his mind, she should have been grateful that he was protecting the neighborhood from suspicious activity. Instead, she was arguing with him and making him feel foolish. You know what? Morrison said, his voice rising to just below a shout. I don't like your attitude. I don't like the way you're talking to me. And I definitely don't like the way you think you can just show up here and start demanding things. Rodriguez could see that the situation was spiraling out of control. She had worked with Morrison long enough to know that when he got like this, he sometimes made decisions that got them both in trouble later. Danny, she said more firmly, let's just run her information through the system and verify everything. If it all checks out, we can move on. But Morrison wasn't listening to her anymore. He was focused entirely on Lisa, and Lisa could see something dangerous building in his expression. I think you need to come with us to the station so we can sort this out properly, Morrison said. Put your hands on the car. What? Lisa couldn't believe what she was hearing. You want to arrest me for standing in my own driveway? I want you to put your hands on the car and follow instructions, Morrison replied, his hand now resting directly on his weapon. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Lisa looked at Rodriguez, hoping to see some sign that the other officer would step in and stop this madness. But Rodriguez was looking at the ground, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to directly challenge her partner. The neighborhood around them was quiet, except for the sound of a dog barking in the distance. A few porch lights had come on in nearby houses, and Lisa wondered if any of her neighbors were watching this unfold. She wondered if they would step in to help, or if they would just assume that the police must have a good reason for what they were doing. Lisa knew she was at a crossroads. She could identify herself as an FBI agent right now and end this encounter immediately. Or she could see how far Morrison was willing to take his power trip. As someone who spent her career investigating exactly this kind of behavior, she was both fascinated and horrified by what was happening to her. Lisa took a deep breath and made her decision. She would not put her hands on the car like some criminal. She would not be arrested in her own driveway for the crime of being black in a nice neighborhood. It was time to end this charade. "Officer Morrison," she said, reading his name tag clearly for the first time. "Before this goes any further, I need to show you something very important." Morrison's grip tightened on his weapon. "I told you to put your hands on the car. Stop talking and start following orders." "I'm going to reach into my purse very slowly," Lisa continued, her voice calm but firm. "I'm going to show you my federal identification." "Federal identification?" Rodriguez stepped closer, suddenly paying much more attention to what was happening. "I'm Special Agent Lisa Washington with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Lisa said clearly, making sure both officers could hear every word. "I'm going to show you my credentials now." Morrison's face went pale, but he didn't lower his hand from his weapon. "That's impossible." "You're lying." Lisa moved very slowly, keeping her hands visible as she reached into her purse. She pulled out a black leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing her FBI badge and identification card. The gold badge caught the light from the street lamp, and her photo was clearly visible next to the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Special Agent Lisa Washington, badge number 2847, she said, holding the credentials out so both officers could see them clearly. "I work in the Civil Rights Division, investigating cases of police misconduct and violations of federal civil rights laws." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison stared at the badge like it was some kind of alien artifact. Rodriguez moved closer to get a better look, and Lisa could see the recognition and concern spreading across her face. "This has to be fake," Morrison said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "Anyone can buy a fake badge online." Rodriguez examined the credentials more carefully. She had seen FBI identification before during joint operations, and these looked completely authentic. The badge was real metal, not plastic. The identification card had all the security features she would expect to see. The photo clearly matched the woman standing in front of them. "Danny," Rodriguez said quietly, "these look real." "They are real," Lisa confirmed. "Officer Morrison, you have just held a federal law enforcement agent at gunpoint in her own driveway for no legitimate reason whatsoever. You have violated my civil rights and potentially committed several federal crimes." Morrison's hand finally moved away from his weapon, but he was still trying to process what was happening. But you were acting suspicious. You were driving slow and looking around like you were up to something." "I was driving home from work," Lisa replied. "I was driving slowly because it was raining earlier and the streets were wet. I was looking around because I like to see my neighbors and check on my neighborhood." "Those are not crimes, Officer Morrison." Rodriguez stepped between them, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "Agent Washington, I apologize for any confusion. This appears to have been a misunderstanding." Lisa turned her attention to Rodriguez. "Officer Rodriguez, this was not a misunderstanding. This was racial profiling, plain and simple. Your partner saw a black woman in a nice neighborhood and decided I didn't belong here. No amount of proper identification would have satisfied him, because he had already made up his mind about who I was based on the color of my skin." "That's not true," Morrison protested, but his voice was shaking now. "I was just doing my job. We get calls about suspicious activity in this area all the time." "What call?" Lisa asked sharply. "What suspicious activity were you responding to? Show me the dispatch record for the call that brought you to my street tonight." Morrison opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. There had been no call. There had been no report of suspicious activity. He had followed Lisa purely based on his own assumptions and biases. "There was no call," Lisa continued when Morrison didn't answer. "You followed me for several blocks, watched me pull into my own driveway, and then decided to question me about why I was at my own home. You demanded identification, which I provided. You questioned whether my identification was real. You questioned whether my car was really mine. You suggested I might be planning to break into my own house, and when I asked you to explain what law I was breaking, you became aggressive and threatened to arrest me." Rodriguez could see that they were in serious trouble. She had witnessed everything Lisa was describing, and she knew that none of it would look good in an official report. Worse, they were dealing with an FBI agent who clearly knew exactly what her rights were and what procedures they should have followed. "Agent Washington," Rodriguez said carefully, "is there some way we can work this out? Maybe we could just chalk this up to a miscommunication and move on?" Lisa looked at Rodriguez with a mixture of disappointment and frustration. "Officer Rodriguez, you stood there and watched your partner violate my civil rights. You saw him escalate a situation where no crime was being committed and no law was being broken. You had multiple opportunities to intervene and stop this from happening, but you chose to stay silent. That makes you complicit in what happened here tonight." "I was trying to support my partner," Rodriguez said weakly. "Your partner was wrong," Lisa replied. "When your partner is violating someone's constitutional rights, your duty is to stop him, not support him. That's what good cops do. They don't let bad cops get away with behavior like this." Morrison had been listening to this exchange in growing panic. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation without destroying his career. "Look, Agent Washington, maybe I made some mistakes tonight. Maybe I could have handled things differently, but I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." "By assuming that a black woman couldn't possibly live in a nice neighborhood?" Lisa asked. "By treating me like a criminal in my own driveway? By refusing to accept valid identification? Because it didn't fit your preconceived notions about who belongs where?" "I never said anything about race," Morrison protested. "You didn't have to say anything about race," Lisa replied. "Your actions spoke louder than any words could have. Tell me, Officer Morrison, how many white residents of this neighborhood have you stopped for the crime of pulling into their own driveways?" Morrison couldn't answer that question, and everyone standing there knew why. Lisa looked around at her neighborhood, noticing that several porch lights were now on and a few neighbors were visible in their windows. She wondered how many of them had witnessed what just happened. She wondered how many of them were surprised to see police officers in their quiet street, and how many of them had assumed she must have done something wrong. "This is what I investigate for a living," Lisa said, looking directly at Morrison. "I spend my days documenting cases where police officers abuse their power, violate people's rights, and use their badges to intimidate citizens who haven't committed any crimes. I've seen hundreds of cases just like this one, where officers let their personal biases override their professional training." Rodriguez was starting to understand the full scope of what had happened. "Agent Washington, what happens now?" Lisa considered the question carefully. She could file a complaint with their department. She could report this incident to her supervisors at the FBI. She could contact the local prosecutor's office about potential criminal charges. She could reach out to civil rights organizations about a federal investigation into the police department's practices. "What happens now," Lisa said finally, "depends on what you two do next. This conversation is far from over." Morrison felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about this situation had been turned upside down. The woman he had been treating like a criminal was actually a federal agent with the power to end his career. The simple traffic stop he had initiated was now a potential federal civil rights violation. The backup he had called for support was now a witness to his misconduct. "Agent Washington," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what do you want from us?" Lisa looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I want you to understand that what you did tonight was wrong. I want you to acknowledge that you stopped me, questioned me, and threatened me for no reason other than the color of my skin. And I want you to think very carefully about whether this is the kind of police officer you want to be." The street around them was completely quiet now, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The weight of the moment settled over the three people standing in Lisa's driveway. Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Rodriguez kept glancing between her partner and Lisa, clearly trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. Lisa stood calmly, but inside she was thinking through all the implications of what had just happened. "Officer Morrison," Lisa said, breaking the silence, "I need you to write down exactly what happened here tonight. Everything from the moment you first saw me until right now. Don't leave anything out and don't try to make yourself look better than you were." Morrison's hands were shaking slightly as he pulled out his notebook. "What are you going to do with that?" "I'm going to compare your version of events with my own notes and with any witness statements I can gather," Lisa replied. "If your report is honest and accurate, that will be noted. If you try to lie or cover up what happened, that will also be noted." Rodriguez stepped forward. "Agent Washington, I know this looks bad, but Danny's a good cop most of the time. He He sometimes gets a little too focused on his job. Lisa turned to Rodriguez with a look that could have melted steel. Officer Rodriguez, let me explain something to you. There is no such thing as being a good cop most of the time when it comes to civil rights violations. Either you treat all citizens with equal respect and dignity or you don't. There's no middle ground. I understand that, but do you? Lisa interrupted. Because you stood there for 20 minutes watching your partner violate my constitutional rights. And you didn't say a word to stop him. You had a duty to intervene when you saw him acting inappropriately, and you failed in that duty. Rodriguez felt her face flush red. She knew Lisa was right, but it was hard to hear it said so directly. I was trying to figure out the best way to handle the situation. The best way to handle the situation was to tell your partner that he was wrong and needed to stop, Lisa said firmly. The best way to handle the situation was to de-escalate instead of standing by while things got worse. While this conversation was happening, Morrison was scribbling frantically in his notebook, trying to remember every detail of the encounter. He kept stopping and starting, crossing out words and rewriting sentences. His version of events was coming out as a confused mess of justifications and excuses. I can't write this, Morrison said finally, looking up from his notebook. Everything I write makes me sound like a racist. Maybe that's because your actions tonight were racist, Lisa replied without hesitation. The question is whether you're willing to admit that and learn from it, or whether you're going to keep making excuses. I'm not a racist, Morrison protested. I've never used racial slurs. I don't burn crosses or anything like that. Lisa shook her head sadly. Officer Morrison, racism isn't just about slurs and cross burning. Racism is about making assumptions about people based on their race. It's about treating people differently because of the color of their skin. It's about deciding that a black woman couldn't possibly belong in a nice neighborhood. That's exactly what you did tonight. Morrison wanted to argue, but he couldn't find the words. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had seen a black woman driving through his patrol area and had immediately assumed she was up to something criminal. He had never questioned why he felt that way or whether his assumptions were fair. What's going to happen to my job? Morrison asked quietly. That depends on a lot of factors, Lisa replied. It depends on whether your department takes this seriously. It depends on whether you're willing to acknowledge what you did wrong and work to fix it. It depends on whether this is part of a pattern of behavior or an isolated incident. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. She knew this wasn't an isolated incident. She had seen Morrison treat other Black and Hispanic residents with suspicion and hostility. She had seen him find excuses to stop people who were just going about their normal business. She had always told herself it wasn't her problem, but now she was realizing that her silence had enabled his behavior. Agent Washington? Rodriguez said hesitantly. If Danny gets in trouble for this, what happens to me? Lisa studied Rodriguez's face carefully. That depends on what you do next. You can continue to cover for your partner and pretend this was just a misunderstanding. Or you can be honest about what you witnessed and commit to doing better in the future. What do you mean doing better? I mean speaking up when you see officers violating people's rights. I mean intervening when your partner, as behavior crosses the line. I mean remembering that your first duty is to the Constitution and the law, not to protecting other cops who break the rules. As they talked, Lisa noticed that more lights were coming on in neighboring houses. A few people had come out onto their porches to see what was happening. Mrs. Chen from across the street was standing in her doorway with her arms crossed. Mr. Peterson, from next door, was looking out his window with obvious concern. Looks like we have an audience, Lisa observed. I wonder what they're thinking about all this. Morrison glanced around nervously. He had never considered how his actions might look to the people who lived in the neighborhood he was supposed to protect. Now he was wondering if any of them had cell phones out, recording what was happening. Agent Washington, Rodriguez said. Maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. Why? Lisa asked. Are you embarrassed about what happened here? Good. You should be embarrassed. Maybe that embarrassment will help you remember this moment the next time you're tempted to let your partner abuse his power. Just then, Mrs. Chen walked across the street toward them. She was an elderly Asian woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. Lisa had met her a few times and found her to be kind and thoughtful. Excuse me, Mrs. Chen said politely. Is everything all right over here? I heard raised voices and saw the police cars. Morrison started to answer, but Lisa spoke first. Mrs. Chen, These officers stopped me because they thought I looked suspicious pulling into my own driveway. Mrs. Chen looked confused. Suspicious? But you live here. I've seen you coming and going for months. That's what I told them, Lisa replied. But Officer Morrison here decided that a black woman couldn't possibly belong in this neighborhood. Mrs. Chen's expression hardened as she looked at Morrison. Young man, I've been living in this neighborhood since before you were born. I've seen all kinds of families move in and out over the years. Good people come in all colors and troublemakers do too. If you can't tell the difference, you shouldn't be wearing that badge. Morrison felt like he was being attacked from all sides. Ma'am, I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. Safe from what? Mrs. Chen asked sharply. Safe from a woman parking in her own driveway? Safe from someone different from you? I came to this country 40 years ago and I've heard that excuse before. It wasn't acceptable then, and it's not acceptable now. Rodriguez watched this exchange with growing discomfort. She could see that the community was not going to support Morrison's actions. If this story got out, it would be a public relations nightmare for the entire police department. Mrs. Chen, Rodriguez said, we appreciate your concern, but this is a police matter. This is a community matter, Mrs. Chen replied firmly. This is my neighbor being harassed by police for no good reason. That affects all of us. Lisa felt a surge of gratitude toward Mrs. Chen. It meant a lot to have a neighbor stand up for her, especially when she was facing hostility from the very people who were supposed to protect and serve the community. Thank you, Mrs. Chen, Lisa said. It's good to know that my neighbors are paying attention to what happens on our street. By now, Mr. Peterson had also walked over from his house. He was a retired teacher in his 60s who had always been friendly to Lisa. I was watching from my window, he said. I saw the whole thing. That officer had his hand on his gun like he was expecting trouble. All because someone parked in their own driveway. That's not right. Morrison realized that his version of events was falling apart. He had assumed that no one was watching, that he could handle this situation quietly and move on. Now he had multiple witnesses who had seen his behavior, and none of them seemed to think he had acted appropriately. Agent Washington, Morrison said desperately, maybe we could start over. Maybe I could apologize and we could forget this whole thing happened. Lisa looked at him with a mixture of pity and frustration. Officer Morrison, you can't apologize your way out of violating someone's civil rights. You can't just say sorry and make this disappear. What you did tonight was serious and it's going to have serious consequences. The small crowd of neighbors was growing as more people came out to see what was happening. Lisa could see that some of them were holding cell phones, and she suspected that at least part of this encounter had been recorded. This is going to be all over social media by tomorrow, Rodriguez muttered to Morrison. Good, Lisa said, overhearing her. Maybe that will help people understand what really happens when police officers let their biases control their actions. 3 weeks later, Lisa sat in the conference room of the FBI field office, looking across the table at Agent David Kim, her supervisor in the Civil Rights Division. Spread out between them were police reports, witness statements, cell phone videos, and a thick file documenting Officer Morrison's history with the Oakwood Heights Police Department. The body camera footage tells the whole story, Agent Kim said, sliding a tablet across the table to Lisa. Morrison's camera captured everything from the moment he started following you. There's no question about what happened or why it happened. Lisa reviewed the footage again, watching herself from Morrison's perspective. She could see how calm and professional she had remained throughout the encounter, even as Morrison became increasingly aggressive and unreasonable. More importantly, she could hear Morrison's own words providing clear evidence of his racial bias. What about Rodriguez? Lisa asked. She's cooperating fully with the investigation, Agent Kim replied. She admitted that she should have intervened earlier, and that she's witnessed similar behavior from Morrison before. She's agreed to participate in additional training and to testify if necessary. Lisa nodded. Rodriguez had called her personally 2 days after the incident to apologize, and to provide additional information about Morrison's pattern of behavior. It was clear that the encounter had been a wake-up call for her about her own responsibilities as a police officer. And Morrison? Agent Kim's expression grew serious. Morrison is in trouble. The police department suspended him immediately after our investigation began. They found 3 other complaints against him from the past 2 years, all involving Black or Hispanic residents who said he treated them with suspicion and hostility for no legitimate reason. What kind of complaints? Similar to what happened to you. Unnecessary traffic stops, aggressive questioning, demanding identification from people who were just walking through their own neighborhoods. One case involved him searching a teenager's backpack because he said the kid looked like he didn't belong at the bus stop. Lisa shook her head sadly. How many people suffered because his department didn't take those complaints seriously? That's exactly what we're going to find out, Agent Kim said. We're opening a comprehensive investigation into the entire police department. We want to know if Morrison's behavior was an isolated problem or part of a larger pattern of civil rights violations. Over the following months, the investigation expanded far beyond just Officer Morrison. The FBI interviewed dozens of residents, reviewed hundreds of police reports, and analyzed data on traffic stops, arrests, and use of force incidents. What they found was disturbing but not surprising to Lisa, who had seen similar patterns in other departments across the country. The data showed clear evidence of racial bias in policing. Black and Hispanic residents were stopped at much higher rates than white residents, even though they were less likely to be found with contraband or weapons. They were more likely to be arrested for minor offenses that white residents typically received warnings for. They were more likely to have force used against them during arrests. Morrison, it turned out, was not an outlier. He was simply the most obvious example of a problem that ran throughout the department. Several other officers had similar patterns of behavior, and the department's leadership had consistently failed to address complaints from community members. The investigation also revealed that Rodriguez had been telling the truth about witnessing Morrison's behavior before. Internal affairs records showed that she had filed informal complaints about him twice, but nothing had been done to address the issues she raised. 6 months after the incident in Lisa's driveway, the Department of Justice announced a comprehensive settlement agreement with the Oakwood Heights Police Department. The agreement required extensive reforms, including new training on racial bias and constitutional policing, a complete overhaul of the complaint process, and ongoing federal monitoring of the department's practices. Morrison was terminated from the police force and faced federal charges for violating Lisa's civil rights. He eventually pleaded guilty to 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law and was sentenced to 6 months in prison and 2 years of probation. Rodriguez kept her job but was required to complete additional training and to serve as a mentor for new officers on the importance of intervening when colleagues crossed the line. She also became one of the department's most vocal advocates for the reforms that were implemented as part of the federal agreement. Lisa continued her work with the FBI, but the incident had changed her in ways she was still processing. She had always known intellectually that racial bias in policing was a serious problem, but experiencing it personally had given her a different perspective on the cases she investigated. The hardest part, she told Agent Kim during one of their regular check-ins, is knowing how many people go through this without having an FBI badge to protect them. How many people get arrested or hurt or worse because they can't prove they belong where they are. That's why this work matters, Agent Kim replied. Every case we investigate, every department we reform, every officer we hold accountable makes it less likely that someone else will go through what you experienced. A year after the incident, Lisa was invited to speak at a community meeting in Oakwood Heights about the changes that had been implemented in the police department. The meeting was held at the local high school, and the auditorium was packed with residents who wanted to hear about the progress that had been made. Lisa stood at the podium, looking out at the faces in the audience. She could see Mrs. Chen and Mr. Peterson in the front row, along with many other neighbors she had come to know better over the past year. She could also see several police officers, including Rodriguez, who had become a genuine ally in the reform efforts. A year ago, Lisa began, I was held at gunpoint in my own driveway by a police officer who decided I didn't belong in this neighborhood. That incident was traumatic and wrong, but it also became an opportunity to address problems that had been hurting this community for years. She talked about the investigation, the reforms that had been implemented, and the ongoing work to rebuild trust between the police and the community. She acknowledged that change would take time and that there would be setbacks along the way. But I've seen real progress, Lisa continued. I've seen officers who are committed to doing better. I've seen community members who are willing to work with police to solve problems. I've seen a police department that is finally taking complaints seriously and holding officers accountable for their actions. After her speech, a young black man approached Lisa during the reception. He introduced himself as Kevin, a college student who lived a few blocks away from her. "I wanted to thank you," Kevin said quietly. "Last month, I was walking home from work late at night and a police officer stopped me. But instead of treating me like a criminal, he was polite and professional. He asked if I was okay if I needed help getting home safely. I couldn't help thinking that might not have happened before all these changes." Lisa smiled and shook Kevin's hand. "That's what good policing looks like. That's what every community deserves." As she drove home that night, Lisa thought about how much had changed in the year since Morrison had pulled into her driveway with his suspicions and his biases. The incident had been painful and frightening, but it had also led to real improvements in how the police department served the community. She thought about Morrison, who was now working at a warehouse and attending mandatory counseling sessions as part of his probation. She wondered if he had learned anything from the experience, if he understood now how his actions had affected not just her but the entire community. She thought about Rodriguez, who had become a different kind of police officer after being forced to confront her own failure to act. Rodriguez now regularly spoke to new recruits about the importance of standing up for what's right,
even when it means challenging a fellow officer. Most of all,
Lisa thought about the community that had rallied around her that night. Mrs. Chen and Mr. Peterson and the other neighbors who had refused to let injustice happen in silence. Their willingness to speak up and get involved had been crucial to ensuring that the incident led to real change rather than just another complaint that disappeared into a filing cabinet. As she pulled into her driveway, the same driveway where it all began, Lisa reflected on the long road toward justice. It was never a straight line and it was never easy, but with persistence, courage, and community support, it was possible to turn even the worst moments into opportunities for positive change. The motion sensor light came on as she walked toward her front door, illuminating the path she had walked so many times before. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like coming home to a community where she truly belonged, where she was valued and protected rather than suspected and questioned. The work was far from over. There would be more cases to investigate, more departments to reform, more officers to hold accountable. But for tonight, Lisa was content to know that her neighborhood was a little bit safer and more just than it had been a year ago, and that was progress worth celebrating.